Welcome to Lord Nightmare channel. We share scary stories with rainy ambience. I hope this video helps you in some way to sleep, relax, or just be entertained for a while. If you enjoy it, please think about subscribing and hitting the thumbs up button to help my channel out. Now let's begin.
When I first moved into the house, I wasn't expecting much. It was an old, unassuming property at the end of a quiet street. I bought it for a good price, which in hindsight should have been my first red flag. But at the time, I chalked it up to luck, a rare find in today's housing market. The first week went smoothly enough. I spent my days unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and getting to know the quirks of the place. The floorboards creaked, the water pressure in the shower was weak, and the kitchen had a faint smell of dampness no matter how much I cleaned. Nothing out of the ordinary for a house this age. But then I found the door. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the basement. I'd gone down to store some tools when I noticed it. A small door, no more than 4 feet tall, tucked into the corner behind the water heater. It was painted the same dull gray as the walls and had no handle, just a keyhole. I didn't remember seeing it when I'd first toured the house. But then again, the basement was dimly lit, and I hadn't spent much time down there. Curiosity got the better of me. I tried to open it, but it was locked. I searched the entire basement, hoping to find a key, but there was nothing. It was frustrating, but I decided to leave it for another day. That night, I heard the noise. At first, it was faint, like the sound of a distant dripping faucet. I dismissed it, figuring it was the pipes. But as the hours dragged on, it grew louder. It wasn't dripping. It was scratching. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound was coming from the basement. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray cat that had somehow gotten inside. I grabbed a flashlight and a broom, my best idea of a weapon, and headed downstairs. The basement was freezing, far colder than the rest of the house. My breath hung in the air as I descended the creaky wooden stairs. The scratching stopped the moment I reached the bottom. I scanned the room with my flashlight. Everything was as I'd left it. No sign of any animals. But when I pointed the light at the small door, I froze. It was open. The door was ajar, revealing a dark, narrow space beyond. The air was thick, carrying a smell I can only describe as rot and earth, like a graveyard after rain. I should have walked away, called someone, anyone. But instead, I leaned in closer, shining my flashlight into the space. The beam caught something reflective like glass. That's when I saw it, a mirror propped against the far wall. It was old, its surface tarnished and speckled with age. But what made my skin crawl was the reflection. It wasn't me. The figure in the mirror was wearing my clothes, but their face was wrong. Their features were twisted, their eyes sunken and hollow. And they were smiling. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me and locking it for good measure. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a threat. When morning finally came, I called a locksmith. The locksmith arrived that afternoon, a gruff man in his 50s. I led him to the basement, explaining the situation as best I could without sounding completely insane. He inspected the door, frowning. "This isn't part of the original house," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. He pointed to the edges of the frame. "This was added later. And look here," he tapped the keyhole. "It's an antique lock. You don't see these much anymore. Whoever put this in didn't want anyone getting inside." I didn't tell him it had already opened. He worked on the lock for almost an hour but couldn't get it open. "You'll need a specialist for this one," he said, packing up his tools. Honestly, I'd just leave it alone if I were you. That night, the scratching came back. It was louder this time, more insistent. I could hear it through the floorboards, accompanied by faint whispers. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was cold, almost mocking. Desperate, I grabbed a hammer and went back to the basement. I was done being afraid. I was going to rip that door off its hinges if I had to. But when I got there, the door was gone. The wall where it had been was now smooth, unbroken concrete. There was no sign a door had ever been there. I moved out a week later. I didn't care about losing money on the house. I just wanted to be as far away from it as possible. A few months after I moved, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for any information about the house. Buried in old news archives, I found an article about a man who had lived there in the 1970s. He'd gone missing. His wife claimed he'd been acting strangely before his disappearance, saying he would spend hours in the basement talking to someone who wasn't there. The article mentioned something else. The house had been built over a cemetery. Most of the bodies had been relocated, but a few graves had been overlooked. I don't know what I saw in that basement. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the mirror and wonder what would have happened if I'd stepped through that door. When I bought the house, the realtor warned me it had a history. She was vague, dodging my questions with platitudes about every old house having its quirks. I should have pushed harder for answers, but the price was unbeatable and it was in a great neighborhood. I convinced myself that whatever history it had couldn't be that bad. The move-in was uneventful, but I noticed something odd right away. The smallest bedroom upstairs, the one I'd planned to use as a home office, felt wrong. The air was heavy, like the room was holding its breath. When I stepped inside for the first time, I felt this strange prickling sensation, like being watched. I laughed it off as nerves and decided I'd tackle unpacking that room later. For now, I just shut the door. But the door never stayed shut. That first night, I woke up to a soft creak. I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I sat up, my heart pounding, and stared into the darkness. That's when I noticed the hallway light spilling into my bedroom. I could have sworn I'd closed my door before going to bed, but now it was wide open. I got up to check, and as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something else. The door to the small bedroom was open too. I had shut it. I was sure of it. I walked over and pushed it closed again, this time twisting the knob to ensure it latched. Satisfied, I went back to bed. The next morning, it was open again. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the house settling, the door shifting because of an uneven frame. But as the days went on, things started to escalate. Objects would move. I'd leave my coffee mug on the kitchen counter, only to find it in the living room. Lights flickered even after I replaced the bulbs. And the small bedroom door? It was always open, no matter how many times I closed it. One night, I decided to test it. I shut the door, wedged a chair under the knob, and even taped the edges with duct tape. There was no way it could open on its own. At 3:14 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the chair scraping across the floor. I didn't want to go back to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won. The next morning, I found the tape torn cleanly off, the chair neatly pushed to the side, and the door wide open. I started avoiding the room altogether, but that didn't help. The atmosphere of the house changed. It felt oppressive, like I was constantly being watched. I started hearing faint noises at night, whispers too soft to make out. One evening, I invited my friend Sarah over, desperate for some normalcy. I didn't tell her about what had been happening. I just said I wanted company. She noticed it almost immediately. "What's with that room?" she asked, nodding toward the small bedroom. The door was, of course, open. "I don't know," I admitted. "It won't stay closed." Sarah frowned and got up, walking toward the room. "Do you mind if I take a look?" "Be my guest," I said, half hoping she'd find some logical explanation for everything. She stepped inside and I followed. The moment we crossed the threshold, the air changed. It felt colder, heavier. Sarah froze, staring at the far corner of the room. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze but saw nothing. just an empty corner. See what? I asked. Her face went pale. We need to leave, she said, backing out of the room. No. After Sarah left, she called me and begged me to move out. She wouldn't tell me what she saw, only that it wasn't human. I laughed nervously, but her fear was infectious. That night, I slept with all the lights on. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. They were coming from upstairs. I grabbed my phone and crept to the bottom of the staircase. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, frozen, listening to the deafening silence. Then a single thud. It came from the small bedroom. I should have called the police. I should have run. But instead, I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like it might be my last. When I reached the top, I saw it, the small bedroom door, swinging gently open and shut, as if someone had just walked through it. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. I bolted back downstairs, grabbed my keys, and left the house. I spent the night in my car, parked at a gas station. The next day, I called a paranormal investigator. He was skeptical at first but agreed to come by that evening. When he arrived, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked straight to the small bedroom and stepped inside. After a few minutes, he came out, his face grim. "This house isn't haunted," he said. I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "It's the room," he said. "It doesn't belong here." "What does that mean?" I demanded, but he just shook his head. "I suggest you leave," he said. "And don't look back." I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. I couldn't stand the thought of taking anything that had been in that house with me. A few weeks later, I got curious and searched for the history of the property. What I found still keeps me up at night. The house had been built on the site of a mental institution that burned down in the 1930s. The wing that had housed the most violent patients was never fully demolished. It had just been bricked over and built around. The small bedroom? It was directly above where that wing had been. I don't know what was in that room, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still feel it watching me. When I moved into the house, it wasn't because I wanted to. It was because I had to. My life had been falling apart. A breakup, job stress, and a desperate need to start over. The rental was cheap, out of the way, and quiet. Exactly what I thought I needed. The first thing I noticed about the house was how quiet it was. Too quiet. No birds chirped outside, no distant hum of cars. Just silence. The kind of silence that made you painfully aware of every sound you made. Your breathing, the rustle of your clothes, the creak of the floorboards under your feet. I didn't mind at first. It was peaceful, I told myself. A blank slate. But then I started hearing the whispers. It was subtle at first, so subtle I thought I was imagining it. A faint, almost imperceptible murmuring just on the edge of hearing. I'd pause what I was doing. Washing dishes, unpacking boxes, and listen. But the moment I stopped moving, the sound would disappear. I blamed it on stress. Moving was overwhelming, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers became harder to ignore. They always came from somewhere close, like someone was standing just behind me. I'd whip around, my heart hammering, only to find an empty room. One night, I heard them in my bedroom. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the faint sound of hushed voices began to creep through the stillness. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I strained to make out the words. I couldn't understand them, but they sounded angry. The next day, I decided to investigate. I scoured the house, tapping walls, checking vents, looking for anything that might explain the noise. Maybe it was an old heating system, or the house settling, something logical. But the more I searched, the more I realized there was no explanation. The walls were solid, the vents disconnected. The house shouldn't have been making any noise at all. That night, the whispers turned into voices. It started around midnight. I was lying in bed when I heard it again, this time louder. A man's voice, low and guttural, coming from the living room. "Get out," it growled. I bolted upright, my pulse racing. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a lamp, and crept down the hall. The house was dark, the air heavy with that oppressive silence. When I reached the living room, it was empty. But the voice came again, this time from the kitchen. "Leave." I stumbled backward, clutching the lamp, my throat dry. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The only response was a soft chuckle, low and mocking. I didn't sleep that night. The voices continued, moving from room to room, whispering, laughing, threatening. By morning, I was a wreck. My hands trembled as I packed a bag. I was ready to leave, but as I reached the front door, I stopped. Something wasn't right. I stared at the door, my fingers hovering over the lock. I couldn't explain it, but the thought of leaving filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Like if I walked out that door, I'd never come back. And deep down, I knew the house didn't want me to leave. Over the next few days, things got worse. The whispers turned into screams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of doors slamming, furniture scraping across the floor. My belongings started moving, books would be stacked in odd piles, chairs turned to face the walls. One night, I woke to find every picture frame in the house turned upside down. The final straw came when I found my name scrawled on the bathroom mirror in condensation. I hadn't taken a shower that day. I called a friend, desperate for help. She agreed to come over, though I could tell she didn't believe me. When she arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. "See," she said, after we'd spent an hour sitting in the living room. "It's just an old house. You're letting your imagination run wild." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But as she stood to leave, something changed. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She paused, her brow furrowing. "Hear what?" Then we both heard it, a deep, guttural voice, clear as day, coming from the hallway. "Get out." Her face went pale. She didn't say a word, just grabbed her keys and bolted. I wasn't far behind. That night, I stayed in a motel. I couldn't go back, not after what we'd heard. But as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, I felt a strange pull. A nagging thought at the back of my mind. The house didn't want me to leave, and I didn't want to leave it. The next morning, I went back. I told myself it was just to grab a few things, but deep down, I knew the truth. The house was in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about it, dreaming about it. When I stepped inside, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The whispers were gone, the air no longer heavy. It felt welcoming. I should have left. I should have run and never looked back. But instead, I stayed. That was 6 months ago. The voices don't scare me anymore. In fact, I've started talking back. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can feel them listening. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see them staring back. When my husband and I decided to move into a new house, it wasn't just an exciting moment. It felt like the perfect beginning for our little family. The house was big enough for the three of us, me, my husband, and our 5-year-old daughter, Lila. With a spacious backyard and a quiet neighborhood, we believed we had found the perfect place to start fresh. The first day in the house went smoothly. Lila was thrilled, running around with her favorite doll, her laughter filling every corner. But on the first night, everything changed. That night, I was organizing our bedroom when Lila suddenly appeared in the doorway, clutching her doll tightly. Her face was pale, and her wide eyes were filled with fear. "There's someone whispering in my room, Mom," she said in a small voice. I gave her a gentle smile, assuming her imagination was running wild. "It's probably just the wind, sweetheart." This house is new to us all. Let's get you back to bed. I walked her back to her room, ensuring her nightlight was on and tucking her in snugly. But as I closed the door, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of her room. I froze for a moment, then shook my head. It must have been the wind, I told myself. I returned to our room, trying to push the strange sound from my mind. The next morning, Lila looked tired as we sat down for breakfast. "Did you not sleep well?" my husband asked. "Someone wanted to play with me," she said quietly, staring down at her spoon. We exchanged confused glances. "Who wanted to play?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She shrugged. "A little girl. She said she wanted to be my friend." A chill ran down my spine. But I didn't want to scare her, so I replied, "Maybe you dreamed it?" She only nodded slightly. That day, I tried to shake off the unease. But that night, something happened that made my blood run cold. I was washing dishes in the kitchen when I heard a small laugh coming from the living room. Thinking it was Lila, I went to check. The room was empty, dimly lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. Her toys were scattered across the floor. And then I saw it, one of her dolls moved. Not a fall or a tumble, but a deliberate, slow movement, like someone was holding it. I collapsed to the floor, my heart racing. When I blinked, the doll was still again, lying motionless. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The nights grew worse. Lila woke up more frequently, her small face pale with fear. She began talking about her new friend, who she said lived in her closet. "She says I can stay here, but you can't," she whispered one night, her voice flat, almost unlike herself. I tried to soothe her, but the strange feeling in the house became impossible to ignore. My husband, who had been skeptical at first, began to feel it too. One night, he woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. When he got up to check, he saw Lila's bedroom door slowly creaking open, even though we had locked it. That night, we decided to have Lila sleep in our room. But the disturbances didn't stop. I woke up to the sound of whispers right next to my ear. When I opened my eyes, I saw a dark shadow standing in the corner of the room. I couldn't move. The shadow just stood there watching us. When I tried to wake my husband, it vanished. The haunting grew stronger. Footsteps, whispers, and shadows became part of our daily lives. Lila started to change. She became quiet, often sitting in the corner of a room, seemingly engaged in a conversation with someone invisible. One night, I found her standing in front of the mirror in her bathroom, staring at her reflection with an eerie smile. When I called her name, she slowly turned to me, and I swear her eyes looked different, darker, emptier. I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. We called a paranormal expert for help. He arrived with a serious expression, carrying strange equipment I didn't recognize. After walking through the house, he stopped in Lila's room. "There's something here," he said quietly. "Something that doesn't want you here." He lit a candle and began chanting, but the flame went out almost immediately. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "This place is not for the living." We didn't wait any longer. That night, we packed what we could and left the house. As we stepped outside, Lila turned to look back and whispered, "She said she'll find us." We moved to another city, into a much smaller house. The disturbances stopped, but Lila still wakes up crying at night. Sometimes she stares blankly at a corner of the room, as if seeing something we can't. I don't know if we truly escaped, but there are nights when I hear faint whispers in the silence. It's not over. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Strange whispers, shadowy figures, or something you just couldn't explain? I'd love to hear your stories. Share your experience in the comments below, and let's talk about the unexplained. Don't forget to like this video if it gave you chills, and subscribe for more real-life scary stories. Who knows? Your story might even inspire our next video. Let's keep the conversation going and uncover the mysteries together.